Charles Sobhraj was born into chaos, and the chaos followed him his entire life. He entered the world on April 6th, 1944, in Saigon, then part of French Indochina. The son of a Vietnamese woman and a French-Vietnamese father who had little presence in his life. From the beginning, identity for Sobhraj was complicated. A patchwork of nations and names, an origin story that would make him both adaptable and unmoored. His childhood was fragmented. His mother moved to French-controlled southern Vietnam, and his father's absence left the boy in the care of various relatives. At an early age, Charles learned the lesson that would become his trade. Survival often required performance, deception, and reinvention. He changed names as often as most children change clothes. Each new name was another persona, a fitted mask that helped him navigate foreign streets, unfamiliar languages, and shifting alliances. As a young man, he left Southeast Asia and drifted into the cosmopolitan hubs of the era. He passed through Karachi, Bombay, and Beirut. He lived briefly in Paris. He spent time in the Dutch East Indies. Wherever he went, he exhibited the same talents: fluency in several languages, a handsome, disarming face, and a skill for reading people quickly. But language skill and good looks were only instruments. Behind them lay a far more dangerous aptitude, an appetite for con games, manipulation, and a willingness to cross moral lines when opportunity called. In the 1960s, Sobhraj settled for a time in Europe, where petty cons and theft became his schooling. He learned to pick pockets and to charm hotel clerks. He learned how to take a stolen passport and, with the right story, make it credible. He developed a particular method: be both friendly and authoritative, project an air of belonging, and use the trust that generates to locate vulnerability. But what would make Charles Sobhraj notorious was not petty theft alone. It was his migration in the late 1960s and early 1970s into the expansive, chaotic landscape of the Asian Overland Trail. The so-called Hippie Trail that connected Europe to South and Southeast Asia. Long-haired Western travelers, many young and trusting, moved along that chain of border towns and bazaars. The trail was fueled by idealism and by naivete, people seeking spiritual experience, cheap living, and adventure. It was also, for predators, an ecosystem of opportunity. Sobhraj recognized that opportunity with a cold, professional eye. He settled in Kathmandu, Bangkok, and the coastal towns of South Asia that catered to foreigners. He cultivated the image of a worldly, generous man, quick with a joke, helpful with local knowledge, and eager to introduce foreigners to restaurants, shops, and crucially, drugs. In the world of the trail, he offered things that travelers wanted and expected: an easy connection to local opium, heroin, or hash, an elegant flat in which to crash, directions that felt intimate and insider. He did not work alone. His circle, which shifted and changed, included women who were as attractive and disarming as he was. Some historians and investigators have argued that Sobhraj used romantic relationships as both camouflage and control. He targeted a very specific set of people: transient Westerners, often single men traveling by themselves, often strangers to local law enforcement. These were people who could be isolated, defrauded, and, in the worst cases, removed from the world without immediate scrutiny. His methods were often elegant in their cruelty. Sobhraj specialized in a dual attack: first the con, and then the physical elimination. A typical pattern involved drugging a target or inducing a stupor through high doses of narcotics. The traveler would wake up confused, their possessions gone. Passports, cash, credit cards. Sobhraj's crew would then use the victim's documentation to buy plane tickets, withdraw money from ATMs in the victim's name, or check into hotels under stolen identities. The result was twofold. The perpetrator acquired immediate financial gain, and the victim, separated from identifying documents, became vulnerable. When the trail required it, Sobhraj escalated. He arranged murders that were sometimes concealed as accidents and sometimes staged as suicides. Some victims were stabbed, others were suffocated. Often bodies showed signs suggesting the killer had attempted to make the death appear accidental or drug-related. The region's patchwork of jurisdictions, the porous borders, uneven police resources, and language barriers made it possible for a skilled manipulator to erase much of his trail. To illustrate the modus operandi with specificity, imagine a young traveler in a guest house in Kathmandu. He meets a charming stranger who offers to take him to a party. Drinks are shared. Later, he wakes with a headache, the room sticky, his wallet gone. He pinches himself. He finds he has no passport. Panicked, alone in a strange city, he tries to reconstruct the night. If he presses the wrong person for answers, the wrong alliances could be formed. If he speaks to the wrong host, he risks blaming himself in a foreign tongue. Sobhraj's approach depended on the victim's disorientation. It depended on the assumption that a missing Westerner would not immediately trigger a coordinated cross-border hunt. As bodies accumulated and disappearances were investigated, a more brutal pattern emerged. Victims appeared in resorts and backstreets across Afghanistan, India, Nepal, and Thailand. Among those whose disappearances would later be connected to Sobhraj were young Americans, Canadians, and Europeans traveling through the region. Detectives in different countries began to whisper about a single predator moving across borders. But connecting those whispers into a dossier took time, and some very particular pieces of evidence. There are two critical moments in Sobhraj's evolution from predator to public enemy. The first was his increasing brazenness. He began to insert himself into investigations, feigning innocence and, at times, posing as an amateur detective who wished to help. He would occasionally be found in the crowd at inquests, offering condolences and local knowledge. It was a classic predator move: appear helpful, control the narrative, and misdirect suspicion. The second was an escalation in violence and audacity that culminated in two very public crimes in Bangkok in 1975. American tourist Connie Jo Bronzik disappeared in 1975 after traveling in Southeast Asia. Later that year, Canadian expatriate Christina Seifert disappeared in Nepal. What ultimately broke the pattern, drawing international attention, was not just the violence, but the sloppy overreach that accompanied it. Sobhraj had been careful for a long time. He had also been lucky. But luck, for all predators, is finite. Sobhraj's knack for manipulation extended beyond the victims. He was mischievously media savvy. He manufactured a persona in which he was not just a thief or murderer, but an actor on an international stage. He cultivated relationships with Western journalists and hotel staff, both to advertise his cosmopolitan credentials and to gain informal influence over the stories that were being told about disappearances. When police in Bangkok finally began to suspect him, they found that Sobhraj had allies and informants within the traveler community who would vouch for him. People who saw only charm where others would later see ruthlessness. In December 1975, Bangkok police, enraged and troubled by the mounting evidence, arrested Charles Sobhraj in a dramatic sweep. He was charged with multiple murders and offences that included theft and fraud. The case that unfolded in Thailand was unlike many others in the region. It was public, internationally followed, and theatrically complex. Sobhraj, always an actor, leaned into the drama. He would later be called by some journalists a master of deception, a charismatic killer, and in darker sketches, a handsome serpent. The moniker the Serpent would stick, partly for his methodical stealth, partly for the way he slid through borders and identities. Once behind bars, Sobhraj did not fade into the anonymity of a prison cell. He continued to manipulate. He confessed to some crimes and denied others, offered reroutes of responsibility, and, to many observers, seemed to enjoy the spectacle of court proceedings. It was during these years that investigators began to assemble a more complete dossier. Witness testimony, accounts from former associates, and forensic links that tied Sobhraj to multiple murders. Ballistic evidence in some cases matched bullets found at scenes to weapons in his possession or associated with his group. There were also accounts of his involvement in stolen passports and credit card fraud that placed him in the days before victims vanished. But the Thai legal system of the mid-1970s was different from what many Westerners expected. Sobhraj's case ran into the thicket of politics, bureaucracy, and conflicting jurisdictions. The trial that eventually took place in India for murders there, the proceedings in Thailand, and the legal entanglements in Nepal overlapped and sometimes contradicted one another. Sobhraj's defense teams were skilled at exploiting procedural gaps, and the man himself, ever the celebrity, used public attention to pressure and confound prosecutors. It is important to examine the complex network Sobhraj maintained. He was not a lone wolf in a solitary sense. There were women and men who helped him, lovers, accomplices, and attractees who benefited from or were bullied into participation. Several members of his circle would later testify, some reluctantly, some eagerly, about the day-to-day mechanics of the crimes, how victims were selected, the techniques used to render them incapacitated, and the logistics of selling or pawning stolen goods. In many cases, the accomplices were as morally compromised as the man they followed. In other cases, they were victims themselves, coerced into complicity by charm and threat. Once the trial machinery ground forward, the public spectacle intensified. Western embassies kept a close eye on the proceedings. Journalists flew into Bangkok. Travelers convened in bars to trade rumors. For a time, Sobhraj's case made the nightly news in multiple countries. His image, a handsome, self-assured man with an inscrutable smile, dominated headlines. The tension between charm and brutality made an intoxicating story for readers and viewers, and that attention complicated prosecution. In some ways, global fascination became part of the evidence. It revealed how a man could use narrative and celebrity as protective armor. Charles Sobhraj's legal journey was not linear. In some locales, he was convicted. In others, charges were dropped or delayed. In India, he was arrested in 1976 and later convicted of murders that took place on Indian soil. He was sentenced to prison time there. What made the case almost mythic was not simply the conviction, but Sobhraj's repeated ability to slip from custody. He escaped from Indian prisons at least twice, once in 1986 and again some years later. Acts of audacity that further burnished his legend. Each escape read as proof in the public imagination of a man who could outsmart authority. Escape requires planning, patience, and inside knowledge. Sobhraj's prison breaks were not the product of sudden luck. They were calculated events, exploiting moments of laxity, corrupt officials, or procedural holes. In one escape, he reportedly leveraged the kindness or ignorance of prison staff. In another, he simply moved with such composure that the system folded around him. And each time, he disappeared into the geography that had once protected him. The space between borders, the modern nomad's alleyways, the hospitality of complicit accomplices. During periods at liberty, Sobhraj continued to shape his own mythology. He traveled under multiple names. He courted journalists and offered interviews that blended confession with theatricality. He wrote books, including a memoir that framed him as a victim of circumstances and a man who had learned to survive by being adaptable and bold. Critics, of course, saw the memoir as exploitation. A desperate man selling himself as enigma to the highest bidder. The truth was darker and more complicated. The man enjoyed the attention. He knew how to monetize infamy. Psychologists who later studied Sobhraj's life debated how to categorize him. He exhibited traits of psychopathy, charm, manipulativeness, lack of remorse, and an ability to lie convincingly. He also displayed boredom and thrill-seeking that, combined with skill, made him lethal. Some experts argued that his early deprivation and fractured identity contributed to a sense of entitlement, that he was owed the world and free to take it. Others emphasized the cold rationality of his crimes. He was not always responding to trauma. Often he was making a business decision about victims and profit. But clinical explanation, while useful, does not excuse victims. The human cost of Sobhraj's crimes is immeasurable. Families mourned sons and brothers, partners and friends who went missing and never returned. Some bodies were never found. Others were discovered in unsettling circumstances that left little room for closure. For each statistical tally, there was a story of grief. Passports left on kitchen tables, letters in English classrooms, mothers waiting for children who would never walk back through the door. When Sobhraj was finally recaptured for good, years later in a US embassy operation in Kathmandu, in 2003, he was not the unblemished man of his early conquests. Time and imprisonment had worn him. He had aged, certainly, but he had also become more theatrical. The Nepali authorities arrested him after a long campaign of investigative work. They charged him not only with decades-old crimes, but also with modern offences of fraud and duplicitous travel. For the Nepali public, who had heard rumours and legend for years, the capture was vindication. The Serpent had been cornered. The trial in Nepal was notable for its intensity and for the way it attracted global attention. Sobhraj's defense lawyers once again argued procedural technicalities and contesting evidence. But the weight of testimony, the circumstantial links, and the persistence of investigative journalists and family members who had campaigned for justice created a legal pressure the man could not evade. In 2004, he was convicted in Nepal for the murder of an American tourist, and in the years that followed, he faced additional convictions tied to the string of killings on the Asian Trail. As the convictions accumulated, so too did attempts at contextualization. Scholars, victims' advocates, and journalists began to interrogate broader questions. What is the responsibility of host nations to protect transient travelers? How did the geopolitics of post-colonial Asia produce conditions that allowed predators to operate? Were there colonial legacies in policing and jurisdiction that made cross-border crime easier and prosecution slower? These questions were not merely academic. They pointed to structural elements that allowed a predator to flourish. A patchwork of consular limitations, police corruption, and the often precarious status of the very travelers who became victims. In prison, Sobhraj maintained his defiant posture. Even while incarcerated, he was a writer, a self-promoter, and at times a provocateur. He gave interviews, sometimes juxtaposing empathy with detachment. On some occasions, he expressed regret in a way that read as a performance, while at other moments he was candid and bluntly unapologetic. Observers argued about whether he had matured or simply learned to play a new role for modern media. The moral complexity of the Sobhraj story resides not only in the individual acts, but in the way society reacted. The case revealed the hunger of audiences for a villain who was neither purely monstrous nor wholly human. The public wanted to see evil with a coherent motive, and yet Sobhraj resisted simple categorization. He was at once a cruel opportunist and an almost mythic actor on the seams of a globalizing world. The spectacle of his life, the prison escapes, the books, the interviews, created an odd kind of celebrity. It tempted some viewers to admire an intelligence gone awry, even as others recoiled at the violence he left in his wake. When historians evaluate Sobhraj's impact, they often return to the broader phenomenon of the 1970s. A decade in which borders opened for tourists, in which young Westerners traveled light and trusting, and in which old systems of authority had not yet adapted. This interim between tradition and globalization provided cover. The court systems and police forces that might have been effective in another era were ill-equipped to handle an itinerant, multilingual conman who could appear in one city and vanish into the next. It is tempting to read Sobhraj as uniquely evil, a cautionary figure at the edges of civilization. But he was also a product of certain possibilities. Post-war migrations, the shifting economies of Asia, the shock of a cultural meeting grounds where law and habit had not kept pace, recognizing that context does not mitigate his crimes. Rather, it clarifies how such a man could both operate for so long and capture the world's imagination. Ultimately, the legal register caught up with Sobhraj. He died in prison in Kathmandu in 2004, or, depending on the account and the jurisdiction being cited, was imprisoned for the remainder of his life after convictions in multiple countries. His later years in custody were less glamorous than his days on the trail. He was no longer the smooth operator who could charm his way out of a police statement. He was a man in a cell, subject to a legal process that, across jurisdictions, finally accumulated a consensus about his guilt. The story of Charles Sobhraj remains a lens through which to examine the collision of charisma and cruelty, of travel culture and vulnerability, of a world increasingly connected yet perversely fragmented. The Serpent moved through the cracks of a changing world and, for years, used its seams for profit and violence. He left a trail of victims whose stories are sometimes lost in the legend. In recounting Sobhraj's life in detail, the task must be to restore that human center. If we return to the beginning of his life, we see the building blocks of his capability: instability, shifting identity, and talent deployed without moral constraint. Those elements alone do not explain monstrous behavior, but they help us map the architecture of a life that could become so predatory. The narrative is not a deterministic one. It does not claim that childhood abuse guarantees a criminal fate. But it does suggest that certain environments produce certain capacities. And without remediation, those capacities can be used for harm. There is no final moral accounting that fully satisfies the families of the lost. The criminal justice system can punish. It cannot always heal. The story of Charles Sobhraj should therefore be read both as a true crime chronicle and as a social mirror. It shows how human mobility, institutional weakness, and the human propensity to trust can combine to create opportunities for predators. And it shows how celebrity and narrative can sometimes obscure the raw human cost of criminality. At the end of the story, what remains are the fragments: passport stubs, pawnshop receipts, witness statements, trial transcripts, and the slow work of families seeking closure. The Sobhraj case endures because it forces questions rather than offering tidy answers. It compels us to look beyond the glamour of a confident criminal and to see instead the work of careful investigation, the persistence of victims' advocates, and the slow arc of justice across borders. Thank you for listening. If this long-form investigation stirred questions, post them below. We will continue to explore the complicated lives of historical criminals and the systems that both fail and ultimately catch them. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe.